So, recently, I've been reading some books. My current book is The World's Best Fairy Tales. They're a bit insane. They're not like the Disney movies I grew up watching. These are more of the Grimm style. A lot of random shit happens, and things don't really make a lot of sense. So, I thought it'd be a fun idea to read one out for you. So, get yourself a nice cold Milo, get nice and tucked into your bed, and let's go on a journey.
Oi mate, you got a lighter, don't you? You don't mind if I borrow it?
The Boy Who Kept a Secret. Once upon a time, there lived a poor widow who had one son. At first sight, you would not have thought he was different from 1,000 other little boys. Then you noticed that by his side hung a scabbard, and as the boy grew bigger, the scabbard was growing bigger too. The sword which belonged in the scabbard was found sticking out of the ground in the garden, and every day the boy pulled it up to see if it would go into the scabbard. But though the scabbard was plainly becoming longer, it would be some time before the two fitted together. However, there came a day finally when the sword slipped into the scabbard quite easily. The child was so delighted he could hardly believe his eyes. But pleased though he was, he determined not to tell anyone about it, particularly not his mother, who never could keep anything from her neighbours. Still, in spite of his resolutions, he could not hide altogether that something had happened. When he went in to breakfast later, his mother asked him what was the matter.
"Oh, Mother, I had such a nice dream last night," he said, "but I can't tell it to anyone."
"You can tell it to me," she answered.
"No, Mother, I can't tell anybody,"
returned the boy,
"till it comes true."
"I want to know what it was, and know it I will," she cried. "I will beat you till you tell me." But it was no use. Neither words nor blows would get the secret out of the boy. When she stopped beating him, the child ran into the garden and knelt weeping beside his sword. It was working around and around all by itself, and anyone except the boy trying to catch hold of it would have been badly cut. But the moment he stretched out his hand, it stopped turning and slid quietly into the scabbard. For a long time the child sat sobbing, and the noise was heard by the king as he was driving by. "Go and see who is crying so," he said to one of his servants. The servant returned, saying, "Your Majesty, a young boy is sobbing because his mother has beaten him." "Bring him to me at once," commanded the monarch, "and tell him that it is the king who sends for him. Tell him the king has never cried in all of his life, and cannot bear anyone else to do so." On receiving this message, the boy dried his tears and went with the servant to the royal carriage. "Will you be my son?" asked the king.
"Yes, if my mother will let me,"
answered the boy, and the king sent his servant for the mother and told her that if she gave the boy to him, he would live in a palace and marry the king's prettiest daughter as soon as he was a man. The widow's anger now turned to joy, and she kissed the king's hand. "I hope you'll be more obedient to his majesty than you were to me," she said, and the boy shrank from her half frightened. But when she had gone back into her cottage, he asked the king if he might fetch something that he had left in the garden. Given the permission, he pulled up his sword, which he slid into the scabbard. Then he climbed into the coach and was driven away. After they had gone some distance, the king said, "Why were you crying so bitterly in the garden when we came along?"
"Because my mother had been beating me,"
replied the boy. "And why did she do that?" asked the king.
"Because I would not tell her my dream."
"And why wouldn't you tell it to her?"
"Because I would never tell anyone till it comes true," answered the boy.
"And won't you tell me either?" asked the king in surprise.
"No, not even you, your majesty."
"Oh, I am sure you will when we get home," said the king, smiling, and he talked to him about other things till they came to the palace. "I have brought you such a nice present," he said to his daughters, and as the boy was very charming, they were delighted to see him, and gave him all their best toys. "You must not spoil him," observed the king one day, when he had been watching the children playing together. "He has a secret which he won't tell anyone."
"He'll tell me,"
answered the eldest princess, but the boy only shook his head.
"He'll tell me,"
said the second girl. "Not I," replied the boy.
"He'll tell me,"
cried the youngest, who was the prettiest too.
"I'll tell nobody till it comes true,"
said the boy, and as he had said before, "and I will beat anyone who asks me." The king was very sorry when he had heard this. He loved the boy dearly. What? But... But he thought it would never do to keep anyone near him who would not do as he was bidden. So he commanded his servant to take him away and to not let him enter the palace until he had come to his right senses. The sword clanged loudly as the boy was led off, but the child said nothing, though he was very unhappy at being treated so when he had done nothing wrong. However, the servants were very kind to him, and as their children brought him fruit from all sorts of nice things, soon he grew cheerful again, and lived among them for many years till he reached his 17th birthday. Meanwhile, the two eldest princesses had become women, and had married powerful kings who ruled over great countries across the sea. The youngest one was also old enough to be married, but she was very particular and turned up her nose at every young prince who sought her hand. One day she was sitting in the palace, feeling rather bored and lonely, and suddenly she began to wonder what the servants were doing and whether it was not more amusing down in their quarters. The king was at his council, and the queen was ill in bed, so there was no one to stop the princess, and she hastily ran across the gardens to the houses where the servants lived. Outside one of them she noticed a youth who was handsomer than any prince she had ever seen, and in a moment she knew him to be the little boy she had once played with.
"Tell me your secret, and I will marry you,"
she said to him. But the boy only gave her a beating, and he had promised... Sorry. But the boy only gave her the beating he had promised her long ago, when she had asked him the same question. The girl was very angry, besides being hurt, and ran home to complain to her father. "If he had 1,000 lives, I would take them all," swore the king. That very day a gallows was being built outside the town. The people crowded around to see the execution of the young man who had dared to beat the king's daughter. The prisoner, his hands tied behind his back, was brought to the scene by the hangman. His sentence was being read by the judge, amid deathly silence, when the sword clanged against his side. Suddenly, a great noise was heard, and a golden coach with a white flag waved from the window rumbled over the stones. It stopped underneath the gallows, and from it stepped the king of the Magyars, the ruler of Hungary. He begged that the life of the boy might be spared. "Sir, he has beaten my daughter, who merely asked him to tell her his secret. I cannot pardon that," answered the princess's father. "Give him to me. I'm sure he will tell me the secret. If not, I have a daughter who is like the morning star, and he is sure to tell it to her." The sword clanged again, and the king said angrily, "Well, if you want him so much, you can have him. Only never let me see his face again." And he made a sign to the hangman. The cords were removed from the young man's wrists, and he took his seat in the golden coach beside the king of the Magyars. Then the coachman whipped up his horses, and they set out for Buda. The king talked very pleasantly for a few miles, and when he thought that his new companion was quite at ease with him, he asked him what was the secret which had brought him into such trouble. "That I cannot tell you," answered the youth, "until the day it comes true." "You will tell my daughter, I am sure," said the king, smiling. "I'll tell nobody," replied the youth, and as he spoke the sword clanged loudly. The king said not another word, but he was confident that his daughter's beauty would get the secret from him. The journey to Buda was long, and it was several days before they arrived there. The beautiful princess happened to be picking roses in the garden when her father's coach drove up. "Oh, what a handsome youth! Have you brought him from Fairyland?" she cried, when they all stood upon the marble steps in front of the castle. "I have brought him from the gallows," answered the king, rather vexed at his daughter's words, as never before had she consented to giving attention to any man. "I don't care where you brought him from," said the spoiled girl. "I shall marry him and nobody else, and we will live together till we die." "You may tell another tale," replied the king. "When you ask him his secret, after all, he is no better than a servant." "That is nothing to me," said the princess, "for I will love him. He will tell his secret to me, and will always have a place in my heart." But the king shook his head, and gave orders that the lad was to be lodged in the summer house. One day, about a week later, the princess put on her finest dress and went to pay him a visit. She looked so beautiful that, at the sight of her, the book he held dropped from his hand, and he stood up speechless with wonder. "Tell me," she said coaxingly, "what is this wonderful secret? Just whisper it in my ear, and I will give you a kiss."
My angel, he answered, be wise and ask no questions if you wish to get safely back to your father's palace. I have kept my secret all these years and do not mean to give it up now.
However, the girl would not listen, and went on pressing him, till at last he slapped her face so hard that her nose bled. She shrieked with pain and rage, and ran screaming back to the palace where her father was waiting to hear if she had succeeded. "I will starve him to death, the son of a dragon," he cried, when he saw her streaming with blood. Then he ordered all the masons and bricklayers in town to come before him. "Build me a tower as fast as you can," he said, "and see to it there is room inside for a stool and a small table and nothing else." The men set to work, and in 2 hours the tower was built. Then they started for the palace to inform the king that his orders had been followed. On the way, they met the princess, who began to talk to one of the masons. When the rest were out of hearing, she asked if he could manage to make a hole in the tower which nobody could see, large enough for a bottle of wine and food to pass through. "To be sure I can," said the mason, turning back, and in a few minutes the hole was bored. At sunset, a large crowd assembled to watch the youth being led to the tower, and after his misdeeds had been proclaimed, he was solemnly walked up. But every morning the princess passed food to him through the hole. Every third day the king sent his secretary to climb up the tower on a ladder and look down through a little window to see if the boy was dead. But the secretary always came back with the report that he was fat and rosy. "There is some magic about this," said the king. The state of affairs lasted a long time, till one day a messenger arrived from the Sultan of Turkey, bearing a letter from the king and also 3 canes. "My master bids me say," said the messenger, bowing low, "that if you cannot tell which of these 3 canes grows nearest to the root, which in the middle, and which in the top, he will declare war against you." The king was very much frightened when he had heard this, and though he took the canes and examined them closely, he could see no difference between the one or the other. He looked so sad that his daughter noticed it and inquired the reason. "Alas, my daughter," he answered, "how can I help being sad? The Sultan has sent me 3 canes, and says that if I cannot tell him which of them grows nearest to the root, which in the middle, and which at the top, he will make a war upon me. And you know that his army is far greater than mine."
"Oh, do not despair, my father," she said. "We shall be sure to find out the answer." And she quickly ran away to the tower and told the young man what had occurred. "Go to bed, as usual," he replied, "and when you wake, tell your father you have dreamed that the canes must be placed in warm water. After a little while, one of them will sink to the bottom. That is the one which grows nearest the root. The one which neither sinks nor comes to the surface is the one that's cut from the middle, and the one that floats is cut from the top." The next morning the princess told her father of her dream, and on her advice he cut tiny notches in each of the canes when he took them out of the water so he might make no mistake when he handed them back to the messenger. The Sultan, who could not imagine how the king had found out the answer to the puzzle, did not declare war against Buddha. The following year, the Sultan again wanted to pick a quarrel with the king of the Magyars. So he sent another messenger, this one bearing a letter and 3 foals. The letter required the king to say which of the animals was born in the morning, which at noon, and which in the evening. If an answer was not ready in 3 days, war would be declared at once. The king's heart sank when he read the letter. He could not expect his daughter to be lucky enough to dream rightly a second time. To add to his troubles, a plague which was raging through the country had killed off many of his soldiers, and his army was even weaker than before. At this thought, his face became so gloomy that his daughter noticed it and inquired what was the matter. "I have had another letter from the Sultan," replied the king, "and he says that if I cannot tell him which of these 3 foals he has sent was born in the morning, which at noon, and which in the evening, he will declare war at once." "Oh, don't be downcast," she said. "Something is sure to happen," and she ran down to the tower to consult the youth. "Go home, idol of my heart, and when night comes, pretend to scream out in your sleep so your father hears you. Then tell him that you dreamed he was just being carried off by the Turks, because he could not answer the question about the foals. When the lad whom he had walked in the tower ran up and told them which had been born in the morning, which at noon, and which in the evening." So the princess did exactly as the youth had bidden her. No sooner had she spoken than the king ordered the tower to be pulled down and the prisoner brought before him. "I do not think that you could have lived so long without food," he said. "And as you have had plenty of time to repent your wicked conduct, I will grant you pardon. on the condition that you help me solve a terrible problem. Read this letter from the Sultan. You will see that if I fail to answer his question about the foals, a dreadful war will be the result." The youth took the letter and read it through. "Yes, I can help you," he replied. "But first you must bring me 3 troughs, all exactly alike. Into one you must put oats, into another wheat, and into a third barley. The foal which eats the oats is the one which foaled in the morning, the foal which eats the wheat is the one which foaled at noon, and the foal which eats the barley is the one that foaled at night." The king followed the youth's directions, and marking the foals, sent them back to Turkey, and there was no war that year. Now the Sultan became very angry that both of his plots to get possession of Hungary had been such total failures. So he sent for his aunt, whom was a witch, to consult her about what he should do next.
"It's not the king who answered your questions," observed the aunt, when he had told his story. "He's far too stupid ever to have done that. The person who solved the puzzles is the son of a poor woman. If he lives, he will become king of Hungary. Therefore, if you want the crown for yourself, you must get him here and kill him." After this conversation, another letter was written to the king of Hungary, saying that if the youth in the palace was not sent to Turkey within 3 days, a large army would cross the border. The king's heart was sorrowful as he read, because he was grateful to the lad for what he had done to help him. The boy only laughed, bade the king fear nothing and to search the town instantly for 2 youths who looked exactly alike. Then he would paint himself a mask that would make him a replica of them, and the sword at his side clanged loudly. After a long search, twin brothers were found, so identical that even their own mother could not tell the difference between them. The youth painted a mask that was a precise copy of their faces, and after he had put it on, no one would have known one boy from the other 2. They set out for the Sultan's palace, and as soon as they reached it, they were taken straight into his presence. He made a sign for them to come near. They all bowed low in greeting. He asked them about their journey. They answered his questions all together, and in the same words. If one sat down to supper, the others sat down at the same instant. When one got up, the others got up too, and if there had been 1 body instead of 3, the Sultan could not detect any difference between them, and told his aunt that he could not be so cruel as to kill 3 of them. "Well, you'll see a difference tomorrow," replied the witch, "for one will have a cut in his sleeve. That is the youth you must kill." And 1 hour before midnight, when witches are invisible, she glided into the room where the 3 lads were sleeping in the same bed.
Gay!
She took out a pair of scissors and cut a small piece out of the boy's coat sleeve, and then crept silently from the room. But in the morning the youth saw a slit and marked the sleeves of his 2 companions in the same way, and all 3 went down to breakfast with the Sultan. The old witch was standing in the window and pretended not to see them, but witches have eyes in the back of their heads, and she knew at once that not 1 sleeve, but 3 were cut, and they were alike as before. After breakfast, the Sultan, who was getting tired of their whole affair and wanted to be alone to invent some other plan, told them they might return home, so, bowing together they went. The princess welcomed the boy back joyfully, but the poor youth was not allowed to rest long in peace. For one day another letter arrived from the Sultan, saying that he had discovered that the young man was a very dangerous person, and he must be sent to Turkey at once. The girl burst into tears when the boy told her what was in the letter which her father bade her to carry to him.
"Do not weep, love of my heart," said the boy. "All will be well. I will start at sunrise tomorrow."
Soon the next morning, at sunrise, the youth set forth, and in a few days he reached the Sultan's palace. The old witch was waiting for him at the gate, and whispered as he paused, "This is the last time you'll ever enter it." But the sword clanged, and the lad did not even look at her. As he crossed the threshold, 15 armed Turks barred his way, with the Sultan in the lead. Instantly, the sword darted forth and cut off the heads of every one but the Sultan, and then went quickly back into his scabbard. The witch, who was looking on, saw that as long as the youth had possession of the sword, her schemes would be in vain. She tried to steal the sword that night, but it jumped out of its scabbard and sliced off her nose, which was made of iron. And in the morning, when the Sultan brought a great army to capture the lad and take away his sword, they were all cut to pieces, while the boy remained without a scratch. Meanwhile, the princess was in despair because the days slipped by and the young man did not return. She never rested until her father let her lead some troops against the Sultan. Dressed in uniform, she rode proudly before them, but they had just left the town when they met the lad and his sword. When he told them what he had done, they shouted for joy and carried him back in triumph to the palace. There the king declared that the youth had shown himself worthy to become his son-in-law, and that he should marry the princess and succeed to the throne at once, because he himself was getting old and the cares of the government were becoming too much for him. But the young man said he must first go and see his mother, and the king sent him in state with a troop of soldiers as his bodyguard. The old woman was quite frightened at the array which drew up before her little house. She was still more surprised when a handsome young man, whom she did not know, dismounted and kissed her hand, saying, "Now, mother, you shall hear my secret at last. I dreamed that I should become king of Hungary, and my dream has come true. When I was a child, and you begged me to tell you, I had to keep my silence or the Magyar king would have killed me. And if you had not beaten me, nothing would have happened that has happened, and I should not now be the king of Hungary." So that will conclude our tale for tonight. That's from the Folk Tales of the Magyars Andrew Lang collection. If you want to hear more of these, you can post stuff in the comment section. I'd like you to dislike the video, and have a good night.